Life has a way of showing us one face while hiding another. Ricardo and Beatriz were the perfect couple, or so everyone believed. But beneath the surface of their idyllic romance, dark secrets brewed, threatening to unravel everything they built. As the wedding day approaches, whispers of betrayal begin to surface. Could it all just be malicious gossip, or is there more to this story? Stick around to uncover a tale of love, lies, and devastating truths. And don't forget to subscribe to stay with us through this emotional journey. The sun cast a warm glow over Willow Creek, a small town nestled between rolling hills in Pennsylvania. It was a picturesque setting, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing went unnoticed for long. Ricardo leaned against the wooden fence of his family's farm, holding a gilded invitation in his hands. The heavy cardstock shimmered under the sunlight, bearing the names Ricardo Alvarez and Beatriz Williams in elegant calligraphy. It was supposed to be a moment of joy. After all, this was the culmination of a love story that seemed destined from the start. But as Ricardo stared at the invitation, a faint unease settled in his chest. "Is everything okay, son?" his mother, Dolores, called from the porch. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, concern etched into her weathered face. Ricardo turned, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Ma. Just thinking about all the preparations. It's a lot to handle." She nodded knowingly. "Marriage isn't just a big day, it's a lifetime. You sure about this girl?" Her question lingered longer than he wanted to admit. Beatriz was everything a man could ask for, beautiful, ambitious, and intelligent. But lately, there had been moments. Little things. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes when they talked. The excuses about work when she cancelled their plans. Shaking off the thoughts, Ricardo straightened his shoulders. "Of course, I'm sure. Beatriz is amazing." Later that evening, Ricardo met up with Lucas, his best friend since childhood and the best man for the upcoming wedding. Lucas was everything Ricardo wasn't: charismatic, confident, and a natural leader. The two were inseparable, their bond forged in years of shared adventures and hardships. As they sat in the dimly lit corner of a local bar, Lucas clinked his beer bottle against Ricardo's. To the man of the hour. "You're about to marry the woman of your dreams, bro. How does it feel?" Ricardo hesitated. "It feels good. Great, actually." Lucas smirked. "You don't sound convinced." "It's not that. It's just. Do you think it's normal to feel nervous? Like, second-guessing everything?" Lucas leaned back, his expression turning serious. "Cold feet are normal. But if there's something bothering you, you've got to face it head-on. You know that." Ricardo nodded, appreciating the advice. But something about Lucas's tone felt off, too earnest, as if he were hiding something. The next morning, as Ricardo sorted through the mail, a plain envelope caught his eye. It was unmarked, with no return address. He opened it cautiously, finding a single piece of paper inside. "She's hiding something. Ask her about Lucas." Ricardo's heart pounded as he read the message again. The words were like a slap in the face. He crumpled the paper in his hand, his mind racing. Who would send this? And why? Later that evening, Ricardo decided to confront Beatriz. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. "B, can I ask you something?" She looked up, her smile faint. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I got something in the mail today." An anonymous note. He watched her closely for any reaction. "It said you're hiding something." Beatriz's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around her phone. "Ricardo, do you seriously believe some random note? People are jealous of what we have. They'll do anything to tear us apart." Her calm demeanor soothed him momentarily, but the lingering tension in the room was undeniable. "You're right," he said, forcing a smile. I shouldn't let it get to me. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, during a final fitting for his tuxedo, Ricardo received another note. This time, it was slipped into the pocket of his suit jacket. The truth will ruin you. Walk away now. Ricardo felt a cold sweat break out across his back. His hands trembled as he crushed the note, but this time, he didn't confront Beatriz. Instead, he decided to investigate on his own. The night before the wedding, Ricardo couldn't sleep. As he paced his room, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. Check your email. Curious and apprehensive, he opened his laptop. The message contained a single video file. With trembling hands, he clicked play. The screen filled with grainy footage of Beatriz and Lucas. They were laughing, their bodies close, before Lucas leaned in and kissed her. Beatriz didn't pull away. Ricardo's world shattered in an instant. He stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. Why? He whispered to the empty room. The next morning, Ricardo sat alone in the church's empty sanctuary, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. The guests would arrive soon, and the ceremony would begin. But Ricardo knew he couldn't go through with it, not without answers. As the doors creaked open, he looked up to see Helena, Beatriz's mother, entering the room. She was elegant and composed, her piercing eyes scanning him with concern. "You don't look ready to marry my daughter," she said, her voice calm but probing. Ricardo hesitated before showing her the video. Helena watched in silence, her expression unreadable. When it ended, she handed the phone back. "I knew this day would come," she said softly. Ricardo's breath hitched. "You knew? Why didn't you tell me?" Helena's gaze hardened. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. But now you see who she really is. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting colorful patterns on the polished wooden pews. Ricardo sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The video of Beatriz and Lucas replayed in his head like a haunting refrain. Helena, her poised demeanor masking a storm of her own, stood nearby. "You have every right to walk away," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "But if you want justice, I can help you." Ricardo turned to her, his face etched with pain and confusion. "Justice? What do you mean?" Helena stepped closer, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Beatriz has hurt you. She's humiliated you, Ricardo. This isn't the first time she's played with someone's heart, and if you let her walk down that aisle, it won't be the last." Ricardo's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" Helena placed a manicured hand on his arm. "Let me guide you. Together, we can expose her for who she really is. You deserve the truth, and so do all these people who think they're here to celebrate love." Ricardo couldn't shake Helena's words as he returned to the small room where he was meant to prepare for the ceremony. The tuxedo hung on a hook, mocking him with its pristine perfection. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, his usually confident gaze now clouded with doubt. His phone buzzed, and he hesitated before answering. "Ricardo, it's Lucas," came the voice on the other end, far too casual given the circumstances. Ricardo's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" Lucas chuckled nervously. "Just checking in. Big day, huh? I wanted to make sure everything's set." The audacity of his best friend's tone ignited a flame of anger in Ricardo's chest. "You mean set for the wedding? Or for the lies you've been feeding me?" There was a long pause before Lucas responded, his voice suddenly serious. "What are you talking about?" "I know, Lucas," Ricardo said coldly. "I know about you and Beatriz." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was shaky. "Ricardo, listen. It's not what you think. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." Ricardo laughed bitterly. "A mistake? Is that what you're calling it? Kissing my fiancée behind my back, knowing we're about to get married?" "It didn't mean anything," Lucas said desperately. "Please, let's talk in person. We can fix this." Ricardo ended the call without another word. His hands trembled as he set the phone down, his mind racing. The church was beginning to fill with guests, their laughter and chatter echoing in the halls. Beatriz arrived shortly after, looking every bit the radiant bride in her flowing white gown. Ricardo watched her from a distance, noting the way she greeted everyone with her signature charm. To anyone else, she appeared perfect. But to him, she was a stranger, a woman he could no longer trust. Lucas arrived moments later, avoiding Ricardo's gaze as he took his place near the altar. Helena approached Ricardo once more, her presence commanding. "Have you made a decision?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, his face hardening with resolve. "I want to do it. I want everyone to know the truth." Helena nodded approvingly. "Good. But you have to be ready for the fallout. This won't just ruin her, it will change everything for you too." "I don't care," Ricardo said, his voice firm. "She deserves this." As the ceremony began, Ricardo took his place at the altar. The organ music swelled, and the doors at the back of the church opened to reveal Beatriz. She glided down the aisle, her smile radiant, completely unaware of the storm brewing just ahead. When she reached Ricardo, he took her hands in his, but his grip was cold, his expression unreadable. Before the officiant could begin, Ricardo raised a hand. "Before we start, I need to say something." The crowd murmured in confusion as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His heart pounded as he connected it to the projector behind him. "Today is supposed to be about truth and commitment," Ricardo began, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "But I've learned something about truth, it has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply you try to bury it." With a single tap, the video played on the screen behind them. The room fell silent, save for the shocked gasps and whispers of the guests. Beatriz's face turned pale as she watched the incriminating footage. Her hands flew to her mouth, her perfect composure crumbling in an instant. "Ricardo, please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "This isn't the time or place." "Was it the time or place when you betrayed me?" Ricardo shot back, his voice rising. As the room descended into chaos, Lucas stepped forward, his face red with shame. "Ricardo, I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "Don't," Ricardo said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You don't get to apologize. Not now." The guests erupted in confusion and outrage, some leaving in disgust while others stayed, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. Helena watched from the front row, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. She had seen this coming, and now it was all unraveling exactly as she had predicted. Beatriz turned to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Helena's expression hardened. "I've known for a long time, Beatriz. And now, so does everyone else." As the tension reached its peak, Ricardo made a move that shocked even himself. He turned to Helena, pulled her close, and kissed her deeply in front of everyone. The room fell silent once more, the air thick with disbelief. Beatriz let out a strangled cry, her humiliation complete. "I think we're done here," Ricardo said coldly, releasing Helena and walking away, leaving the church and the shattered remnants of his wedding behind. Ricardo walked out of the church, the cold December air biting at his skin, but he hardly noticed. His chest heaved with the weight of everything that had just happened. The sounds of chaos, guests murmuring, Beatriz's sobs, Lucas's panicked apologies, faded as he stepped farther away from the building that had once symbolized hope and unity. Now, it was nothing but ruins. The faint crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel behind him broke his solitude. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "Ricardo, wait." Helena's voice was firm, but there was an undertone of urgency. He stopped but didn't face her. "Why are you here, Helena? Haven't you had enough?" Helena moved closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. She rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You should hear me out. You're not the only one who's hurting." He turned slowly, his eyes searching hers. "This isn't about you." "No," she admitted. "It's not. It's about you, and it's about Beatrice, and the lies she's been telling for years. But more than that, it's about closure, for both of us." They stood in silence for a moment, the winter wind wrapping around them. Helena's composed demeanor began to falter as she spoke again. "You think I came here just to see her embarrassed? To see you suffer?" Helena's voice cracked slightly, betraying the cracks in her icy facade. "I came because I've watched my daughter destroy good men like you time and time again. And no one ever stops her." Ricardo stared at her, conflicted. "Why didn't you stop her, then? You're her mother." Helena laughed bitterly. "You think I didn't try? I raised her better than this, Ricardo. But at some point, people make their own choices. Beatrice decided a long time ago that she could manipulate anyone to get what she wanted." Back inside the church, chaos still reigned. Beatrice was in a side room, her wedding gown crumpled as she slumped into a chair, her hands shaking. Lucas hovered nearby, trying in vain to console her. "This isn't helping, Lucas," she snapped, her voice sharp despite her tears. "I didn't want it to end like this, Lucas replied, his tone desperate. "I told you we should have stopped. Now look where we are." Beatrice glared at him. "You don't get to act like the victim here. You were part of this, too." As their argument escalated, Dolores, Ricardo's mother, stormed into the room. Her usually warm and kind face was set in an expression of fury. "I want both of you out," Dolores said firmly, pointing to the door. "Now." Beatrice's jaw dropped. "You can't." "Oh, I can," Dolores interrupted, her voice rising. "You humiliated my son in front of everyone. Do you think for one second that I'm going to let you stay here and wallow in self-pity?" Meanwhile, Ricardo and Helena drove away from the church in silence. He hadn't asked her to join him, but she had insisted. Now, as they drove through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, he felt the weight of her presence beside him. "Where are we going?" she asked eventually. "I don't know," Ricardo replied honestly. "Anywhere but here." They ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly. It was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple sharing a pot of coffee in the corner. They slid into a booth, and a tired-looking waitress handed them menus. Ricardo stared at his without seeing the words. "I should have seen it coming," he said finally, breaking the silence. "The signs were there, weren't they? The late nights, the excuses. I just didn't want to believe it." Helena placed a hand over his. "You wanted to believe the best in her. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. "And what about you? What's your excuse?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I've been complicit in Beatrice's games for far too long. At first, I thought it was just youthful rebellion, a phase. But as she grew older, I realized it was something deeper, a need to control, to manipulate. I tried to confront her about it, but it always ended the same way. She'd cry, promise to change, and then go right back to her old ways." Ricardo leaned back in the booth, letting her words sink in. "So you gave up?" Helena flinched but didn't deny it. "Maybe I did. But today, seeing you, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Back at the church, Beatrice and Lucas finally left, escorted out by Dolores herself. The remaining guests murmured among themselves, the air thick with gossip. "What do you think will happen now?" one woman whispered to another. "I don't know," her friend replied. "But that poor man. Ricardo didn't deserve any of this." At the diner, Ricardo and Helena stayed until the early hours of the morning, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ricardo felt a sliver of calm amidst the storm. But as they left and walked to their cars, a sense of uncertainty lingered. Ricardo turned to Helena. "This doesn't change anything," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "But maybe it's the start of something new." As she drove away, Ricardo stood alone in the empty parking lot, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: the life he thought he knew was gone forever. Ricardo woke up to the harsh light of morning streaming through the blinds of his small apartment. His head throbbed from the lack of sleep, and his chest still felt heavy with the events of the previous day. He sat up slowly, the memory of Beatrice's betrayal and the chaos at the church rushing back like a tidal wave. The video. The accusations. The kiss with Helena. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his mind replaying every moment in vivid detail. The anger, humiliation, and confusion all mingled together, creating a storm he couldn't escape. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Reluctantly, he stood and opened it to find his mother, Dolores, standing there with a bag of groceries in her arms. "Morning, Ma," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Dolores didn't greet him with her usual warmth. Instead, her face was a mask of concern. "Ricardo," she began as she placed the bag on the counter, "I couldn't sleep last night. All I could think about was what happened." He sighed. "You and me both." Dolores turned to face him, her hands on her hips. "I need to know, what's going on with you and Helena? That kiss." "Ricardo, people are talking." Ricardo winced. He'd been so caught up in his own emotions that he hadn't even considered the fallout from his impulsive act. "It wasn't planned, Ma. It just happened." Dolores raised an eyebrow. "Just happened? You kissed the mother of the woman you were supposed to marry in front of half the town." "I know," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's not like I'm proud of it. But everything was falling apart, and Helena, she's the only one who understood what I was going through." Dolores studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't know what's going on in your heart, Mijo, but you'd better figure it out. Because people aren't going to let this go." Meanwhile, in the Williams sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, Beatrice sat in her childhood bedroom, her head in her hands. She hadn't dared to leave the house since the disastrous wedding. The whispers of the guests and the looks of disgust on their faces haunted her. Helena entered the room unannounced, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Beatrice didn't look up, but her body tensed. "What do you want, Mother?" she asked bitterly. Helena crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "I came to talk." Beatrice scoffed. "Haven't you done enough? You stood there and watched as Ricardo humiliated me in front of everyone." Helena's expression didn't waver. "You humiliated yourself, Beatrice. Don't blame Ricardo for showing people the truth." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes red with anger and tears. "The truth? You mean that video? It was a mistake. And you betrayed me, your own daughter." Helena stepped closer, her voice cold and sharp. "Don't you dare play the victim. You've been lying and manipulating people your entire life, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to you." Beatrice stood abruptly, her fists clenched. "You don't understand. You've never understood me. All you care about is appearances, how things look to other people. But guess what? You're no better than me, mother. Helena's calm facade cracked for just a moment, her eyes narrowing. You're right, she said softly. I'm not better than you. But at least I've learned from my mistakes. Can you say the same? Ricardo spent the afternoon walking through the town, hoping to clear his mind. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of people's stares and whispers. Poor guy, he overheard one woman say as he passed by the bakery. Can you believe what happened at the church? And with Helena of all people. Ricardo quickened his pace, trying to escape the scrutiny. But no matter where he went, it seemed the town was buzzing with gossip about him, Beatrice, and Helena. Eventually, he found himself at the park where he and Beatrice used to spend their weekends. He sat on a bench near the lake, watching as the ducks glided across the water. Mind if I join you? Ricardo turned to see Lucas standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and his expression contrite. What do you want? Ricardo asked, his tone flat. Lucas sighed and sat down anyway. I just wanted to talk. To explain. Ricardo clenched his jaw. There's nothing to explain. You betrayed me, Lucas. You were supposed to be my best friend. I know, Lucas said quietly. And I hate myself for it. But it wasn't just me, Ricardo. Beatrice, she's not who you think she is. Ricardo scoffed. Oh, trust me, I know that now. Lucas hesitated before continuing. She has a way of pulling people in, making them feel special. I never meant for anything to happen, but I fell for it. And by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. Ricardo turned to him, his eyes burning with anger. Do you think that makes it better? That you were just another one of her victims? Lucas looked away, shame written all over his face. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth. As the sun began to set, Ricardo returned to his apartment, exhausted from the day's events. He was surprised to find a note slipped under his door. Meet me at the old lighthouse tonight. We need to talk. Helena. Curiosity and apprehension warred within him as he read the note. What could Helena possibly want to discuss now? That evening, under the cover of darkness, Ricardo drove to the lighthouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, its towering silhouette looming against the starry sky. Helena was waiting for him near the entrance, her coat pulled tightly around her against the cold. You came, she said softly as he approached. Ricardo stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms. What's this about, Helena? She took a deep breath, her breath visible in the frosty air. There's something I need to tell you, something about Beatrice. About why she is the way she is. Ricardo frowned. What do you mean? Helena's gaze dropped to the ground, her usually confident demeanor replaced with hesitation. There's a lot you don't know, Ricardo. About her past. About our family. And I think it's time you knew the truth. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below filled the air as Helena turned toward the lighthouse door. Ricardo hesitated, unsure of whether to follow, but the urgency in her eyes made him move. The cold wind whipped around them as they entered the abandoned building, its interior dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through broken windows. Why here? Ricardo asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Helena glanced at him, her expression somber. This place holds memories, painful ones. And if I'm going to tell you the truth about Beatrice, I need to start here. Ricardo leaned against the crumbling wall, crossing his arms. I'm listening. Helena sat on an old wooden bench, clasping her hands tightly. Beatrice wasn't always like this, she began, her voice trembling slightly. When she was a little girl, she was sweet, full of life. But things changed after her father left. Ricardo's brow furrowed. Her father left? She never told me that. Helena let out a bitter laugh. Of course, she didn't. It doesn't fit the perfect image she's created. But the truth is, he abandoned us when Beatrice was just 10 years old. One day he was there, and the next, he was gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. Ricardo felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. He could picture a young Beatrice, confused and heartbroken. That must have been hard for her. It was, Helena said, nodding. But it was worse for me. I had to pick up the pieces, keep a roof over our heads, and deal with the shame of being left behind. And in the midst of all that, I didn't see what was happening to Beatrice. What do you mean? Helena's eyes darkened. She started to change. She became manipulative, using her charm to get what she wanted. At first, it was small things, lying about school, stealing money from my purse. But as she got older, it escalated. She learned how to wrap people around her finger, to make them feel special so she could use them. Ricardo's stomach churned as Helena's words began to paint a picture that felt all too familiar. And you didn't stop her? I tried, Helena said, her voice heavy with regret. But every time I confronted her, she turned it around on me. She'd cry, say I was a terrible mother, that I didn't love her enough. And the truth is, I started to believe her. Maybe if I'd been stronger, she wouldn't have turned out this way. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the distant sound of the waves. Ricardo ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. So, what? You're saying this is all your fault? He asked, his tone harsher than he intended. Helena flinched but met his gaze. No. Beatrice made her own choices. But I won't deny that my mistakes played a part in shaping her. Ricardo's jaw tightened as anger and sadness swirled within him. Why are you telling me this now, Helena? What am I supposed to do with this information? Helena stood, her voice firm. Because you need to know that Beatrice isn't going to change. You deserve to move on, Ricardo. But if you let her back into your life, she'll destroy you. The drive back from the lighthouse was a blur. Ricardo's mind was a storm of thoughts, memories of Beatrice flashing through his mind. Her laughter, her smile, the way she used to look at him like he was the only person in the world. But now, he couldn't separate those memories from the lies and betrayal. He felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. As he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He picked it up reluctantly, his heart sinking when he saw Beatrice's name on the screen. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. Ricardo, Beatrice's voice was shaky, on the verge of tears. Please, can we talk? I need to explain. There's nothing to explain, Beatrice, he said coldly. I saw the video. I know everything. No, you don't, she insisted. You don't know why I did it. You don't know how I feel. Ricardo laughed bitterly. How you feel? You humiliated me, Beatrice. You betrayed me with my best friend. Why should I care how you feel? Because I still love you, she said, her voice breaking. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a brief moment, he almost believed her. But then he remembered Helena's warning and steeled himself. You don't know what love is, he said before hanging up. The following day, Ricardo decided to focus on rebuilding his life. He spent hours cleaning his apartment, boxing up memories of Beatrice, photos, gifts, anything that reminded him of her. As he worked, a knock at the door interrupted him. He opened it to find Lucas standing there, looking worse for wear. Ricardo, I know I'm the last person you want to see, Lucas began, his voice filled with remorse. But I need to talk to you. Ricardo crossed his arms. You've got 2 minutes. Lucas nodded, taking a deep breath. I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything. I let my feelings for Beatrice get in the way of our friendship, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Ricardo's eyes narrowed. "And you think an apology is enough to fix this?" "No," Lucas admitted. "But I don't want to leave things like this. I messed up, Ricardo. Big time. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The sincerity in Lucas's voice gave Ricardo pause. He wanted to hate him, to shut him out completely. But a small part of him still remembered the years of friendship they had shared. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ricardo said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Lucas nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand. But I'll be here if you ever change your mind." As Lucas left, Ricardo felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He knew it would take time to heal, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. That evening, as he sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We're not done yet. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop downtown. There's more you need to know. Helena." Ricardo stared at the message, his heart pounding. He didn't know what else Helena could possibly reveal, but something told him this was far from over. The bustling sounds of the downtown coffee shop greeted Ricardo as he walked through the door. It was a crisp morning, the kind that usually brought him comfort, but today, the warmth of the coffee shop didn't reach him. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Helena, seated at a corner table by the window. She was the picture of composure, her hair perfectly styled, her coat draped neatly over the back of her chair. But as Ricardo approached, he noticed a faint tightness around her eyes, a sign that even she wasn't immune to the turmoil swirling around them. "You came," she said softly as he sat across from her. "You said there's more I need to know," Ricardo replied, skipping any pleasantries. Helena nodded, her gaze dropping to the untouched coffee in front of her. "There is. And it won't be easy to hear." A waiter approached, but Ricardo waved him off. "Just say it, Helena. I've already been through hell. What could be worse than what I already know?" She hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering her voice. "It's about Lucas." Ricardo tensed at the mention of his former best friend. "What about him?" Helena's eyes met his, and for the first time, Ricardo saw something that looked like fear. "Lucas isn't who you think he is. Beatrice, she wasn't the only one keeping secrets." "What are you talking about?" Ricardo's tone sharpened. Helena reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "I found this at the house. It's from Lucas. Read it." Ricardo stared at the envelope, his stomach knotting. Reluctantly, he opened it and pulled out a handwritten letter. "Ricardo. If you're reading this, it means the truth has come out, and I've lost the one friendship that ever mattered to me. There's no excuse for what I've done with Beatrice, but there's something you need to understand. It wasn't just about her. It was about you. You've always had everything, Ricardo. The respect of everyone in town, a loving family, a successful career. I envied you, even when I didn't want to. And when Beatrice came along, it was like I finally had a way to take something from you. I didn't plan for things to go this far, but once they did, I couldn't stop myself. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know that my actions were born out of my own weakness, not because you deserved any of this. I hope one day you find peace, even if I never will. Lucas." Ricardo's hands shook as he set the letter down. His mind reeled, torn between anger and disbelief. "He envied me," he muttered, more to himself than to Helena. Helena nodded. "It doesn't justify what he did, but it explains a lot, doesn't it? His betrayal wasn't just about Beatrice. It was about destroying something he thought he couldn't have." Ricardo clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Why are you showing me this? What difference does it make now?" Helena's voice softened. Because you deserve the full truth. And because I need you to see that this isn't just about Beatrice. It's about how people like Lucas and her can take advantage of someone like you, someone kind, someone trusting. Her words stung, but they also rang true. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. What am I supposed to do now, Helena? I can't keep living in the shadow of this mess. Helena reached across the table, placing a hand over his. You rebuild, Ricardo. You don't let them win. As Ricardo left the coffee shop, he felt the weight of the letter pressing on him. He couldn't shake the image of Lucas, someone he'd trusted, someone he'd shared his life with, writing those words. The betrayal cut deeper now, knowing it was rooted in jealousy and resentment. He drove aimlessly for a while, his mind replaying Helena's words. Eventually, he found himself outside the hardware store where his father had worked for decades before retiring. The familiarity of the place brought him a small measure of comfort, a reminder of simpler times. Inside, he ran into an old family friend, Mr. Connolly, who greeted him warmly. Ricardo. Haven't seen you around here in a while. How's the big wedding? Ricardo forced a smile. It's complicated. Mr. Connolly's brow furrowed. Well, whatever it is, you'll figure it out. You're a good man, Ricardo. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The words stayed with him as he left the store. Maybe Helena was right, maybe it was time to start rebuilding. Later that evening, Ricardo returned home to find a message on his answering machine. It was Beatrice. Ricardo, I know you don't want to hear from me, but please, just listen. I'm leaving town tomorrow. I can't stay here after everything that's happened. But before I go, I need to see you. Just one last time. Please, meet me at the park tomorrow morning. Her voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment, Ricardo felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place, pity? Regret? He poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at the machine as the message replayed in his head. Should he go? Could he face her one more time after everything she'd done? The next morning, Ricardo stood by the window, watching the gray sky as it threatened rain. He hadn't slept much, torn between the urge to confront Beatrice and the desire to leave her in his past. In the end, curiosity won. He grabbed his coat and headed for the park, unsure of what he'd say, or what she'd say to him. When he arrived, Beatrice was sitting on a bench near the lake, her posture tense and her eyes fixed on the water. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her face pale and drawn. Ricardo, she said softly, standing as he approached. Thank you for coming. I'm not here for you, he said, his tone cold. I'm here because I want answers. Beatrice nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. You deserve that. And I'm ready to tell you everything. The park was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional quack of ducks on the lake. Ricardo stood a few feet away from Beatrice, his arms crossed, his posture rigid. He didn't trust himself to sit, not yet. Beatrice motioned to the bench, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we sit? Please. Ricardo didn't move. Say what you have to say. I'm not here to make this comfortable for you. She flinched at his tone but nodded. Fair enough. She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears that she quickly blinked away. Ricardo, I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I've done. But I need you to understand why it happened. I don't care about your excuses, Ricardo shot back, his voice sharp. You betrayed me. You lied to me. What could you possibly say that would make any of this better? Beatrice looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the bench tightly. It's not about making it better. It's about being honest, for once in my life. Ricardo let out a bitter laugh. Honesty. That's rich coming from you. I know, she said quickly. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or even your time. But I need to tell you the truth. Not for you, but for me." Her words caught him off guard. He hated the way his curiosity still lingered, the way some small part of him wanted to hear her out. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "Talk." Beatrice took another deep breath, her voice trembling as she began. "Do you remember when we first started dating? How perfect everything felt. Like we were in our own little bubble?" Ricardo frowned but didn't respond. "That wasn't real, Ricardo," she said, her voice cracking. "It was a mask I wore. It's the same mask I've worn my whole life. I don't know how to be real with anyone because I've spent so long pretending to be someone I'm not." "Spare me the sob story," Ricardo interrupted. "Everyone has their problems. That doesn't give you the right to hurt people." "You're right," Beatrice said quickly. "But you don't understand. I've been like this for so long, I don't even know who I am anymore. After my dad left, Ricardo held up a hand, his anger flaring. Don't you dare blame this on your father." "I'm not blaming him," she said, her tears finally spilling over. "But when he left, something broke in me. I stopped trusting people. I stopped believing that anyone could really love me. So, I learned how to take what I needed. To manipulate. To lie. It became my way of surviving." Ricardo's fists clenched at his sides. "And what about Lucas? Was he just another way for you to survive?" Beatrice's face twisted with guilt. "Lucas was a mistake. A horrible, selfish mistake. I never meant for it to happen, but," she hesitated, her voice barely audible. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" Ricardo demanded. "Scared of you," she admitted, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Of how much you loved me. Of how much you believed in me. I didn't think I deserved it, so I sabotaged it. I ruined it before you could see who I really was." Ricardo stared at her, his anger momentarily replaced by disbelief. "You're telling me you cheated on me because I loved you too much?" "Yes," she said simply. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ricardo felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath him. "I don't know what I expected you to say," he finally muttered. "But this is worse than I imagined." Beatrice stood, her tears falling freely now. "Ricardo, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm leaving town because I need to start over. I need to figure out who I am, without all the lies." "Good," Ricardo said coldly. "Because there's nothing for you here." She nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For everything." As Beatrice walked away, Ricardo felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and, unexpectedly, relief. Her words hadn't healed the wounds she'd caused, but they had given him something he hadn't expected: closure. For the first time since the disastrous wedding, he felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Ricardo returned to his apartment and found himself standing in front of the box of Beatrice's things he had packed away. Slowly, methodically, he began to take them out and throw them into a trash bag. The photos, the gifts, the mementos, all of it went into the bag, piece by piece. When he was done, he carried the bag to the curb, the weight of it lifting as he let it go. The next morning, as Ricardo sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a text. "Dinner tonight? My treat. Helena." He stared at the message, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to leave Helena and everything associated with Beatrice behind. But another part, the part that remembered her calm, steady presence during the storm, wanted to say yes. After a long pause, he typed a reply. "Okay. Where?" Ricardo arrived at Lou's Diner, a small, cozy restaurant on the outskirts of Willow Creek, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden glow of the streetlights reflected off the frosted windows, and inside, the hum of quiet conversations blended with the clinking of silverware. Helena was already seated at a booth near the back, her coat folded neatly beside her and a glass of red wine in front of her. She looked up as Ricardo approached, offering a faint smile. "You came," she said softly, motioning for him to sit. "I wasn't sure if I should," Ricardo admitted, sliding into the booth. Helena nodded, taking a small sip of her wine. "I understand. After everything, I'm not exactly the easiest person to trust." Ricardo leaned back, crossing his arms. "So why am I here, Helena? What is it you want from me?" She hesitated, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass. "I don't want anything from you, Ricardo. I just thought, maybe we could talk about what happens next." A waiter appeared, and Ricardo ordered a black coffee. Once he was gone, Ricardo fixed Helena with a steady gaze. "What happens next is simple. Beatriz is leaving town, Lucas is out of my life, and I start over. End of story." Helena sighed, her expression softening. "It's not that simple, and you know it." "And why's that?" Ricardo challenged. "Because people like Beatriz and Lucas don't just disappear, Ricardo. They leave scars, doubts, questions you'll wrestle with for years. Starting over isn't just about moving on, it's about figuring out how to carry those scars without letting them define you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He stared down at the empty coffee cup in front of him, his mind racing. "You talk like you know exactly what I'm going through," he said quietly. Helena smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "Because I do." For a moment, Ricardo was taken aback. Helena had always seemed so composed, so untouchable. He couldn't imagine her dealing with anything close to what he was experiencing now. "What happened to you?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Helena glanced out the window, as if gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "When Beatriz's father left, I was devastated. Not just because of the betrayal, but because of what it meant for our family. I had to pick up the pieces alone, and in the process, I lost sight of who I was." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I let the anger and bitterness consume me. I let it shape my decisions, my relationships, my life. And I don't want that for you, Ricardo." The waiter returned with Ricardo's coffee and Helena's dinner, a simple salad with grilled chicken. Ricardo thanked him quietly, his thoughts still on Helena's words. "You're saying I should just forgive them?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Helena shook her head. "No. Forgiveness isn't something you give for their sake, it's something you give for yourself. To let go of the power they have over you." Ricardo frowned, stirring his coffee absently. "I don't know if I can do that. Not yet." "And that's okay," Helena said gently. "Healing takes time. But you need to start somewhere. Otherwise, the anger will eat you alive." As the conversation continued, the mood lightened slightly. Helena shared stories of her life before Beatriz's father, moments of joy and hope that seemed like a distant memory now. Ricardo found himself laughing at her sharp wit, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. "Why didn't I ever notice how funny you are?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "Because you were too busy being swept off your feet by my daughter," Helena replied, her tone teasing. Ricardo chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, I've learned my lesson." Helena's expression softened. "Good. Because you deserve better, Ricardo. Don't ever forget that." As the evening wore on, Ricardo realized he felt lighter. Helena's presence was grounding, her wisdom comforting in a way he hadn't expected. But beneath it all, there was a growing tension, an unspoken connection that neither of them dared to address. When the check arrived, Helena reached for it, but Ricardo stopped her. "You said dinner was your treat, but I think I owe you one for everything you've done." Helena hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough." Outside the diner, the cold air hit them like a wave, their breaths visible in the frosty night. Ricardo walked Helena to her car, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Thank you," he said as she unlocked the door. "For everything. For listening. For helping me see things differently." Helena smiled, her eyes glinting in the streetlight. "You're stronger than you think, Ricardo. Don't forget that." As she got into her car and drove away, Ricardo stood there for a long moment, watching her taillights disappear into the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something he wasn't ready to confront just yet. The next morning, Ricardo woke to another text from Helena. "I think you're ready to take the next step. Meet me at the library this afternoon. There's something I want to show you." Ricardo frowned, curiosity and apprehension warring within him. Helena's cryptic messages always seemed to lead to revelations he wasn't sure he wanted to face. But despite his reservations, he knew he had to go. As he got dressed and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but wonder, what could Helena possibly show him now? The town library was a grand, old building, its towering facade adorned with ivy that crept along the bricks like delicate veins. Ricardo hadn't been here in years, not since his school days. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged paper and wood polish greeted him, triggering a wave of nostalgia. Helena was waiting near the back, seated at a table surrounded by stacks of dusty books. She glanced up as Ricardo approached, offering him a small, reserved smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Ricardo sat, his curiosity tinged with unease. "You said you wanted to show me something. What's all this?" He motioned to the books and documents spread across the table. Helena pushed a folder toward him. "It's about Beatrice's father. And about the choices I made that shaped her into the woman she became." Ricardo's brow furrowed as he opened the folder. Inside were old photographs, legal documents, and newspaper clippings. The first photo caught his attention, a young Helena, radiant and smiling, standing beside a tall, charismatic man who bore a striking resemblance to Beatrice. "That's Raymond," Helena said, her voice soft with the weight of memory. "He was the love of my life. Or at least, I thought he was." "What happened?" Ricardo asked, his eyes scanning the photo. Helena leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "Raymond was charming, ambitious, and reckless. When we met, he swept me off my feet. I was young and naive, and I thought his flaws were just part of his charm. But after Beatrice was born, everything changed." She pulled out a newspaper clipping and handed it to Ricardo. The headline read, "Businessman Arrested in Fraud Scheme." Ricardo's eyes widened. "Fraud?" Helena nodded grimly. "Raymond wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. He got involved in illegal deals, and when things went south, he disappeared, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I had to sell our home, work 2 jobs, and raise Beatrice alone. It was a nightmare." Ricardo set the clipping down, his mind racing. "But what does this have to do with Beatrice?" Helena sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "When Raymond left, Beatrice was devastated. She adored her father, and losing him broke something in her. She blamed me for driving him away, even though I was the one who stayed and sacrificed everything for her." Her voice wavered as she continued. "As she got older, I saw Raymond in her. The charm, the manipulation, the inability to take responsibility for her actions, it was all there. I tried to guide her, to protect her, but I failed." Ricardo shook his head, struggling to process the weight of Helena's confession. "You're telling me Beatrice became who she is because of her father?" Because of what he did to your family? It's more complicated than that, Helena admitted. Raymond's betrayal was the start, but my mistakes only made things worse. I was so focused on surviving that I didn't see how much Beatrice needed me. By the time I realized it, the damage was done. Ricardo leaned back, his hands running through his hair. Why are you telling me this, Helena? What do you want me to do with this information? Helena's eyes softened. I'm not asking you to fix anything, Ricardo. I just think you deserve to know the whole truth. You've been hurt by Beatrice, just like I was hurt by Raymond. And maybe, by understanding where she comes from, you can find a way to heal. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ricardo didn't know how to respond. He wanted to hate Beatrice, to see her as nothing more than a manipulative liar. But now, knowing the pain and loss she had endured, his anger felt complicated. After a long silence, Helena reached for another folder. There's one more thing. Ricardo frowned, his curiosity piqued. What is it? Helena hesitated before sliding the folder across the table. It's about Lucas. Ricardo's heart sank as he opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, text messages, and financial records. He skimmed through them, his confusion turning to shock as the pieces fell into place. Lucas was involved with Raymond's schemes, he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Helena nodded. Not directly, but his father was. Raymond and Lucas's father were business partners before everything fell apart. And when Raymond fled, Lucas's family took a huge financial hit. Lucas grew up resenting your family because, in his mind, you were everything he wasn't: stable, successful, respected. Ricardo felt a surge of anger. So, what? Lucas targeted me because of some grudge his family held against mine? Partly, Helena said carefully. But it wasn't just that. Lucas admired you, Ricardo. He envied you, yes, but he also wanted to be like you. That's why it hurt so much when he betrayed you. It was as much about his own insecurities as it was about Beatrice. Ricardo slammed the folder shut, his emotions boiling over. This is too much, Helena. I don't know how to process all of this. Helena reached across the table, her hand resting on his. You don't have to process it all at once. But you needed to know the truth. Not just about Beatrice, but about Lucas, about Raymond, about everything. Ricardo stared at her, his anger slowly giving way to exhaustion. What am I supposed to do now? Helena's gaze was steady. You move forward. You take the lessons you've learned, and you start building a life that's free from their shadows. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me. As Ricardo left the library, the weight of Helena's revelations pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He felt both liberated and burdened, the truth freeing him from the lies but leaving behind scars that would take time to heal. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a new text. Ricardo, it's Lucas. I know you hate me, and I don't blame you. But I need to talk to you, one last time. Please, meet me tomorrow at the docks. I owe you the truth. Ricardo stared at the message, his chest tightening. He didn't know if he had the strength to face Lucas again, but something told him this meeting was inevitable. The docks at Willow Creek were quiet at dawn, shrouded in a mist that hung low over the water. The rhythmic lapping of waves against the wooden piers and the occasional squawk of a seagull were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Ricardo stood at the edge of the pier, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket as he waited. Lucas had chosen the location, and Ricardo couldn't help but wonder why. The docks were an odd place for a conversation that promised to dredge up more painful truths. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps on the weathered boards drew Ricardo's attention. Lucas appeared through the fog, his face drawn and pale, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something fragile. Ricardo, Lucas greeted, stopping a few feet away. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Lucas," Ricardo replied flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Lucas admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Ricardo shrugged. "I almost didn't. So, say what you need to say. You've got my attention, for now." Lucas rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I owe you the truth, Ricardo. About everything. Not just Beatriz, but everything else, too." Ricardo crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Then start talking." Lucas took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. "I know you've probably heard some of it already. About my dad, about Raymond. It's true. My family's life was torn apart because of what your father and Raymond uncovered about my dad's dealings. When it all came crashing down, we lost everything." Ricardo frowned. "Wait. My dad? My father had something to do with this?" Lucas nodded, his expression conflicted. "Your dad was the whistleblower. He exposed everything, Raymond's fraud, my dad's role in it. He did the right thing, but it destroyed my family. My dad went to prison, and my mom, she couldn't handle the shame. She left." Ricardo felt a pang of shock and guilt. He'd had no idea his father had been involved in any of this. "So, what?" Ricardo said, his tone sharp. "You blamed me for something my father did?" "It wasn't just that," Lucas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I was jealous of you, Ricardo. You had everything I didn't, a family, stability, success. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't measure up. Being around you only reminded me of what I'd lost." Ricardo clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "So, you decided to stab me in the back? You took Beatriz, knowing what she meant to me, just to make yourself feel better?" Lucas flinched but didn't deny it. "I wish I could tell you it wasn't like that, but it was. At first, I didn't even realize what I was doing. But then it became something I couldn't stop. I convinced myself it didn't matter, that you'd never find out, and that I deserved to have something you didn't." Ricardo's voice rose, his anger boiling over. "You're unbelievable. You destroyed our friendship, wrecked my engagement, and for what? To feed your own insecurities?" "I know," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "I know I ruined everything, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to know, it wasn't about you, Ricardo. It was about me. My own weaknesses, my own failures. I took it all out on you because you were the one person who always had it together." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on both men. Ricardo stared at Lucas, his emotions a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and, despite everything, pity. "You think saying this makes it better?" Ricardo asked, his voice cold. "No," Lucas admitted. "But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you the truth. You don't have to forgive me, Ricardo. I don't deserve it. I just needed to say it." For a long moment, Ricardo said nothing. His mind raced, memories of their friendship flashing before him. The laughter, the shared dreams, the trust they'd once had, it was all gone now, shattered beyond repair. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ricardo said finally, his voice quieter. "But I'm done letting you live in my head. You're not worth the space anymore." Lucas nodded, his expression resigned. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For everything." As Lucas turned to leave, Ricardo called out, stopping him in his tracks. "One last thing," Ricardo said, his tone firm. "If I ever find out you've tried to manipulate someone else the way you did me, I won't be this forgiving next time. Do you understand me?" Lucas looked back, his face pale but determined. "I understand. It won't happen again." Without another word, he disappeared into the fog, leaving Ricardo alone on the pier. The drive back home was quiet, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on Ricardo's chest. He didn't feel closure, exactly, but there was a strange sense of finality in what had just happened. For better or worse, he had faced Lucas, heard the truth, and chosen to walk away. When he arrived at his apartment, his phone buzzed with a new message. How did it go? Helena. Ricardo stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a reply. It's over. That evening, as he sat on his couch with a glass of whiskey, Ricardo allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in weeks, the weight of anger and betrayal felt just a little lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And as he drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind. Maybe the scars Lucas and Beatrice left behind wouldn't define him. Maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal. The days following Ricardo's confrontation with Lucas felt strangely quiet. The storm of emotions that had consumed him for weeks, the anger, the betrayal, the sadness, was beginning to settle. He wasn't whole, not yet, but he was no longer drowning. The first step toward reclaiming his life came unexpectedly. While organizing his cluttered apartment, Ricardo found a notebook tucked away in a drawer. It was one he hadn't opened in years, filled with sketches and half-formed ideas for a woodworking business he'd dreamed of starting. He ran his fingers over the pages, the familiar scent of old paper stirring something within him. A longing for purpose. That afternoon, Ricardo visited the Willow Creek Woodworks, a small carpentry shop he used to frequent. The owner, Mr. Harris, was a gruff but kind man in his 70s who had taught Ricardo the basics of woodworking when he was a teenager. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Harris said, his eyes lighting up when Ricardo walked in. "Haven't seen you around here in years, boy. What brings you back?" Ricardo held up the notebook with a sheepish smile. "I was cleaning out my apartment and found this. Thought maybe it was time to stop thinking about it and start doing something." Harris chuckled, slapping Ricardo on the back. "It's about damn time. Let's see what you've got." For the next several hours, Ricardo lost himself in the shop, rediscovering the joy of working with his hands. The rhythmic sound of the saw, the earthy smell of freshly cut wood, the satisfaction of seeing a project take shape, it was cathartic in a way he hadn't expected. When he finally left, his notebook was filled with new ideas, and his heart felt just a little lighter. That evening, as Ricardo cooked dinner, his phone buzzed with a call. He glanced at the screen and saw Helena's name. "Hey," he answered, leaning against the counter. "Hey," she replied, her voice warm. "I was just checking in. How are you holding up?" Ricardo hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Better, actually. I spent the afternoon at Harris's shop. It felt good to get back to something I love." Helena's laughter was soft but genuine. "That's wonderful, Ricardo. I'm glad you're starting to find your footing again." They talked for a while, the conversation flowing easily. Helena shared stories about her garden, her struggles with a particularly stubborn rose bush, and her plans to repaint her kitchen. By the time they hung up, Ricardo realized he felt happy. It was a small, quiet happiness, but it was there. The next morning, Ricardo returned to the shop, determined to make woodworking a regular part of his life again. Harris, ever the mentor, was more than willing to guide him as he honed his skills. "You've got talent, boy," Harris said, watching as Ricardo carefully sanded the edge of a chair leg. "You ever think about selling these?" Ricardo paused, the idea catching him off guard. "I don't know. I mean, I've thought about it before, but..." "But nothing," Harris interrupted. "You've got the skill, and you've got the ideas. All you need is the courage to make it happen." The words stayed with Ricardo as he left the shop that day. Maybe Harris was right. Maybe it was time to stop holding himself back. Later that week, Ricardo met Helena for coffee. They had fallen into a comfortable routine, their conversations a source of comfort and clarity. As they sat by the window, the winter sun casting a soft glow on the table, Helena leaned forward, her expression curious. "So, what's next for you, Ricardo? Now that the dust has settled?" Ricardo took a sip of his coffee, considering her question. "I think I want to give woodworking a real shot. Maybe even start selling my pieces." Helena's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea. You're so talented, Ricardo. I have no doubt you'll succeed." Her encouragement warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. "Thanks, Helena. That means a lot." They talked for hours, their conversation weaving through topics both serious and light-hearted. Ricardo found himself laughing more than he had in weeks, the weight of his past slowly lifting with each shared moment. As their coffee date came to an end, Helena reached across the table, placing a hand on Ricardo's. "You've come so far, Ricardo. I hope you see that." He met her gaze, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper stirring within him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Helena. You've been there for me in ways I didn't even know I needed." For a moment, the world outside the window seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them. There was something unspoken between them, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. But neither of them addressed it, not yet. That evening, Ricardo sat at his kitchen table, sketching plans for a new project. His phone buzzed with a message, and he smiled when he saw Helena's name. "I'm proud of you, Ricardo. You're stronger than you think. Sleep well." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ricardo went to bed with a sense of peace. The wounds left by Beatrice and Lucas were still there, but they no longer consumed him. He was healing, one step at a time. And as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but feel that the future, uncertain as it was, held the promise of something good. The sound of tools clinking filled the air as Ricardo worked on his latest project in the corner of Mr. Harris's workshop. Sunlight poured through the high windows, bathing the wood in a warm glow. Ricardo was focused, his hands moving with purpose as he shaped the curved backrest of a chair. "You're getting faster," Harris remarked from across the room, his tone tinged with pride. "I remember when you spent half a day trying to get a simple joint right. Look at you now." Ricardo chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Guess I'm finally learning from the best." Harris grunted, pretending to grumble, but his expression betrayed his approval. "Don't get too cocky now. A little humility goes a long way in this business." As Ricardo packed up his tools for the day, Harris called out to him. "Hey, boy, come here for a second." Ricardo walked over, curious. Harris handed him a flyer, the edges frayed from being pinned to the workshop's bulletin board. "Local crafts fair is coming up in 2 weeks, Harris said. "Good place to sell your work. What do you think?" Ricardo hesitated, the familiar tug of doubt pulling at him. "I don't know, Harris. I've never sold anything before. What if no one's interested?" Harris fixed him with a stern look. "You don't know unless you try. And besides, I've seen your work. People are gonna love it. Now stop doubting yourself and sign up." Ricardo studied the flyer, his apprehension slowly giving way to a spark of determination. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." Later that evening, Ricardo called Helena to share the news. "A crafts fair," she said, her excitement evident even through the phone. "Ricardo, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." He smiled, her encouragement easing his nerves. "Thanks, Helena. I just hope I don't embarrass myself out there." "You won't," she assured him. "And if you need help setting up or anything, you know who to call." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, and Ricardo found himself laughing at Helena's story about a misadventure in her garden. Talking to her had become a highlight of his day, a steady anchor in the midst of his rebuilding. As the crafts fair approached, Ricardo threw himself into his work, pouring his energy into creating pieces he was proud of. Chairs, tables, decorative shelves, each item was a reflection of his skill and care. The night before the fair, as he sanded the final edges of a small coffee table, he paused to admire his work. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. The morning of the fair was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that brought people out in droves. The town square buzzed with activity as vendors set up booths, displaying everything from handmade jewelry to baked goods. Ricardo's booth was modest but inviting, the polished wood of his creations gleaming in the sunlight. He arranged the pieces carefully, his hands steady despite the flutter of nerves in his chest. "Looks good," came a familiar voice from behind him. Ricardo turned to see Helena, her warm smile like a balm to his anxiety. She carried a thermos of coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "I thought you could use some caffeine," she said, handing him the thermos and a snack. "You're going to need your energy today." Ricardo accepted the coffee gratefully. "You didn't have to come all this way." Helena waved off his protest. "Of course I did. Today's a big day, and I wouldn't miss it for the world." As the fair got underway, Ricardo was surprised by the number of people who stopped by his booth. Shoppers admired his work, their praise genuine and enthusiastic. "This is beautiful," one woman said, running her fingers over the smooth surface of a dining chair. "Did you make this yourself?" Ricardo nodded, his confidence growing with each compliment. "I did. It's all handcrafted." By midday, he had sold several pieces, and his booth was bustling with visitors. Helena stayed nearby, offering support and even helping with a few sales. "You're a natural," she said during a rare quiet moment. Ricardo smiled. "I'm starting to believe that." As the day wound down, Ricardo packed up his booth, exhausted but exhilarated. The fair had been a success, far beyond what he had expected. "You did it," Helena said as they loaded the last of his pieces into his truck. "Yeah," Ricardo replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I guess I did." Helena placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "This is just the beginning, Ricardo. I hope you see that." He met her gaze, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. "Thanks for being here, Helena. It means more than you know." They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading into the background. For the first time in months, Ricardo felt like he was finally stepping into a new chapter of his life, one filled with possibility and hope. Later that night, as Ricardo sat on his couch with the proceeds from the day's sales in front of him, his phone buzzed with a text from Helena. "I'm so proud of you, Ricardo. Today was just the start. Sleep well, you've earned it." He smiled, typing a reply before setting his phone down. "Thank you, Helena. For everything." As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a quiet contentment settle over him. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were healing, little by little. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following the crafts fair were a whirlwind for Ricardo. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek about the quality of his work, and he began receiving calls from people interested in commissioning custom furniture. The small notebook he had dusted off weeks earlier was now filled with sketches, measurements, and deadlines. But even as his days grew busier and his confidence flourished, Ricardo couldn't escape the ghosts of his past. One quiet evening, as he worked late in his apartment, a familiar pang of regret struck him. He set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, staring at the half-finished design in front of him. The memory of Beatrice crept into his mind unbidden, her laughter, her touch, the way she had once looked at him as if he were her whole world. Now he knew it had all been a lie, but the pain lingered like a stubborn bruise. The next morning, Ricardo woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Groggily, he picked it up, frowning when he saw the number. It wasn't one he recognized. "Hello?" he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Ricardo," came a voice that sent a jolt through his system. It was Beatriz. "What do you want?" Ricardo asked, his tone immediately cold. "I need to talk to you," she said quickly. "Please, just hear me out." "You've said everything there is to say, Beatriz," Ricardo replied sharply. "I've moved on." "You should, too." "I have moved on," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't leave things like this. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Despite his better judgment, Ricardo agreed to meet her at the coffee shop downtown. He told himself it was out of curiosity, not a lingering attachment. He needed to know what she could possibly say now, after everything that had happened. When he arrived, Beatriz was already seated in a corner booth, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. She looked different, paler, thinner, and with none of the confidence that had once defined her. "Thank you for coming," she said as Ricardo slid into the seat across from her. "Make it quick," he replied, his tone firm. Beatriz hesitated, her eyes darting around the room before finally settling on him. "I'm leaving Willow Creek for good," she began. "I'm starting over somewhere new, and I want to leave everything behind. But before I go, I need you to know the truth." Ricardo folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "What truth?" Beatriz took a deep breath, her voice wavering as she spoke. "I always knew I was going to hurt you, Ricardo. From the moment we got serious, I knew I didn't deserve you. You were too kind, too trusting. And I've never known how to love someone without destroying them." Ricardo's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Is that supposed to make me feel better? That you hurt me because of your own issues?" "No," Beatriz said quickly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to tell you that it wasn't about you. It was never about you. You did everything right. You loved me the way I didn't know how to love back." Ricardo stared at her, his emotions a storm of anger, sadness, and pity. "Why now, Beatriz? Why tell me this after everything's already fallen apart?" "Because I'm trying to be better," she said softly. "I know it's too late for us, but maybe if I can start being honest, I can stop making the same mistakes. I'm sorry, Ricardo. For everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. Ricardo wanted to lash out, to tell her that her apology meant nothing. But as he looked at her, broken in a way he had never seen before, he felt his anger begin to soften. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But I can let go of the anger. For my own sake." Beatriz's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "That's more than I deserve." The conversation ended soon after, and as Ricardo watched her walk away, he felt a strange sense of closure. The wounds she had caused were still there, but for the first time, he felt like he could start to heal. That evening, Ricardo called Helena, needing the comfort of her steady presence. "How did it go?" she asked gently. "It was hard," Ricardo admitted. "But I think I needed to hear it. And I think she needed to say it." "I'm proud of you," Helena said, her voice filled with warmth. "Facing the past isn't easy, but it's the only way to move forward." "Thanks, Helena," Ricardo said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "And you'll never have to find out," she replied lightly. As the days turned into weeks, Ricardo continued to build his woodworking business, the support from the community fueling his determination. He also found himself spending more time with Helena. Their connection grew deeper with each passing day, the unspoken bond between them becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, as they sat on Helena's porch watching the sun set over the hills, Ricardo turned to her, his heart pounding. "Helena, he began, his voice hesitant. Yes, she asked, her eyes meeting his. I don't know where this is going, he said, his words careful. But I know that I don't want to lose whatever this is between us. Helena smiled, her hand resting lightly on his. You're not going to lose me, Ricardo. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Ricardo felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. With Helena by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The chill of early winter settled over Willow Creek, the kind of cold that made the air sharp and invigorating. Ricardo worked tirelessly in his shop, his hands moving deftly as he shaped a slab of oak into a custom dining table. The rhythmic hum of the sander was soothing, a steady background to his thoughts. He had received more orders than he ever anticipated after the crafts fair, and his small business was finally starting to take shape. It was fulfilling in a way he hadn't expected, but even as he poured himself into his work, Helena was never far from his mind. Their friendship, or whatever it had become, had deepened. The time they spent together felt easy, natural, as though they had known each other far longer than a few months. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable tension, a question neither of them dared to ask: what came next? One crisp afternoon, Helena invited Ricardo to her home for tea. Her house, a charming Victorian with a wraparound porch, was nestled on the edge of town, surrounded by towering pines. As Ricardo stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around him, the scent of cinnamon and cloves lingering in the air. Helena greeted him with a smile, holding a tray of steaming tea and a plate of freshly baked cookies. I thought we could use a break, she said, leading him to the living room. Ricardo sat on the plush sofa, his eyes drawn to the mantel above the fireplace. It was adorned with family photos, most of them of Beatriz as a child. But one photo in particular caught his eye, a younger Helena, her arms around a man who could only be Beatriz's father, Raymond. You still keep his picture up? Ricardo asked, his tone curious. Helena followed his gaze, her smile fading slightly. It's more for Beatriz than for me. She doesn't come here often, but when she does, I want her to know that part of her father's memory is still alive. Even after everything he did? Helena sighed, sitting beside him. Raymond made his choices, and they hurt all of us. But he was still her father. I try to separate the man he was from the mistakes he made. It's not easy, but it's part of how I move on. Her words struck a chord with Ricardo, who was still learning how to separate his memories of Beatriz from the betrayal she had inflicted. As they sipped their tea, Helena turned the conversation toward lighter topics, asking Ricardo about his latest projects. I've got a big order for a custom bookshelf, he said, his tone brightening. It's going to be a challenge, but I'm excited about it. Helena smiled warmly. I'm so proud of you, Ricardo. Watching you rebuild your life has been inspiring. Rebuilding isn't easy, he admitted. But it's been worth it. And having you around has made it a lot easier. Helena's cheeks flushed slightly, but she held his gaze. I'm glad I could be there for you. You've been there for me, too, you know. Their words hung in the air, the unspoken feelings between them growing more tangible with each passing moment. That evening, as Ricardo prepared to leave, Helena walked him to the door. The porch light cast a soft glow over her features, and Ricardo found himself lingering, reluctant to say goodbye. Helena, he began, his voice hesitant. I don't know how to say this, but... Before he could finish, Helena placed a gentle hand on his arm. It's okay, Ricardo, she said softly. You don't have to say anything right now. He nodded, his chest tightening with emotions he couldn't quite articulate. Good night, Helena. Good night, Ricardo, she replied, her smile both comforting and bittersweet. Over the next few days, Ricardo threw himself into his work, hoping to sort through the tangled web of emotions Helena had stirred. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his thoughts kept drifting back to her, the warmth of her smile, the steadiness of her presence, the way she seemed to understand him better than anyone else. One evening, as he sanded the edges of a bookshelf, his phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a text from Helena. "Are you free this weekend? I'd love for you to join me at the winter market in town. It's always been one of my favorite events, and I think you'd enjoy it." Ricardo smiled, the simple message easing the weight in his chest. He typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." "What time?" The winter market was a beloved tradition in Willow Creek, a celebration of the holiday season filled with festive lights, handmade crafts, and the enticing aroma of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider. When Ricardo arrived, he found Helena waiting near the entrance, wrapped in a cozy scarf and a wool coat. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. "I'm so glad you came," she said, linking her arm through his. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, his smile genuine. They spent the afternoon wandering through the market, sampling treats from various stalls and admiring the intricate crafts on display. Helena introduced Ricardo to several locals, many of whom had heard of his woodworking business and were eager to compliment his work. As the sun began to set, the market's twinkling lights created a magical atmosphere. Helena led Ricardo to a small fire pit where they could warm their hands and sip hot cider. "This has always been my favorite part of the market," she said, her voice soft. "There's something about the lights and the fire, it feels like a fresh start." Ricardo glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and affection. "I think I know what you mean. Being here with you, it feels like the start of something good." Helena's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. As they walked back to their cars that evening, Ricardo felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in months. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer weighed him down. And as he looked at Helena, he realized he was ready to embrace whatever came next, no matter how uncertain it might be. The winter market left Ricardo feeling something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. He couldn't stop replaying the way Helena had smiled at him as they stood by the fire pit, her laughter warming him more than the cider in his hands. Something between them had shifted, though neither had put it into words yet. As the days passed, their connection deepened in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Helena would call to check on him, offering advice when he needed it and a listening ear when he didn't. Ricardo found himself looking forward to her texts, their conversations a bright spot in his days. But even as their bond grew stronger, Ricardo couldn't shake the weight of their circumstances. She was Beatrice's mother, a fact that complicated everything. One evening, Ricardo stood in his workshop, staring at a nearly completed bookshelf. The wood gleamed under the overhead light, each shelf precisely measured and sanded to perfection. But his focus wasn't on his work. His thoughts were with Helena. The sharp knock on the door startled him. Wiping his hands on a rag, he opened the door to find Dolores, his mother, standing there. "Ma," Ricardo said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Dolores stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately taking in the workshop. "I came to check on you, Mijo. I've barely seen you lately." "I've been busy," Ricardo replied, motioning to the finished projects around the room. Dolores nodded, but her expression was serious. "And you've been spending a lot of time with Helena." Ricardo froze, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. "How do you know that?" "Willow Creek is a small town," Dolores said simply. "People talk. And I saw the two of you at the winter market." Ricardo leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms defensively. "And what if I have? Helena's been a good friend to me. She's helped me get through a lot." Dolores's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "I don't doubt that. But she's still Beatrice's mother. Have you thought about what that means? About what people will say?" The question hit Ricardo harder than he expected. He had thought about it, too often, in fact. But hearing it from his mother made the reality of their situation even clearer. "I don't know what it means," Ricardo admitted, his voice quiet. "All I know is that she's been there for me when I needed someone. And I care about her." Dolores sighed, stepping closer. "Mijo, I'm not saying this to hurt you. I just don't want you to rush into something you're not ready for. Beatriz left a scar on your heart. Are you sure you're ready to let someone else in?" Ricardo met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, Ma. But I think I want to try." Dolores nodded, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just promise me you'll be careful. For both your sakes." Later that night, Ricardo called Helena. "Ricardo," Helena answered, her voice warm. "I was just about to call you. How are you?" "I'm good," Ricardo said, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "Actually, I was wondering if we could talk. In person." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. Come by tomorrow afternoon?" "I'll be there," Ricardo replied. The following day, Ricardo arrived at Helena's house, his heart pounding as he walked up the steps. She greeted him at the door with her usual grace, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. They sat in the living room, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Finally, Ricardo broke the silence. "Helena," he began, his voice steady. "I need to know where we stand. This," he gestured between them, "whatever it is, it's become important to me. But I can't ignore how complicated it is." Helena's expression softened, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "Ricardo, I've been thinking about it too. I won't pretend it's not complicated. But I also can't deny how much I've come to care about you." Her words sent a jolt through Ricardo's chest. "I care about you too, Helena. But this isn't just about us. It's about what people will think, what Beatriz might say if she finds out." Helena's gaze didn't waver. "Beatriz made her choices, Ricardo. And so have we. We can't live our lives worrying about what other people might think." Ricardo leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And what do you want, Helena? What do you see for us?" Helena's answer was immediate. "I want us to take this one step at a time. I don't know where this will lead, but I know I don't want to lose what we have. You've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever, hope." Her words filled Ricardo with a quiet determination. For months, his life had been defined by loss and betrayal. But with Helena, he saw the possibility of something new, something worth fighting for. "All right," he said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. "One step at a time." Helena reached out, her hand resting gently on his. One step at a time. As Ricardo left that evening, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in weeks. His path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to take the next step. And as he drove home, the thought that lingered in his mind was no longer about the pain of his past, but the promise of what lay ahead. Ricardo's life began to take on a comforting rhythm. Mornings were spent in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and varnish grounding him as he worked on new orders. Afternoons often involved quick trips around town, delivering finished pieces or sourcing wood from nearby suppliers. And evenings were increasingly filled with Helena, whether through quiet phone calls, shared meals, or walks through the snowy trails surrounding Willow Creek. But even as their bond deepened, Ricardo couldn't shake the lingering fear that their fragile happiness would be disrupted. The past, no matter how much he tried to move on from it, had a way of creeping back in. One frosty afternoon, Ricardo was loading a finished dining table into his truck when he noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the workshop lot. For a moment, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. But as the figure stepped closer, his heart sank. Beatrice, he said, his voice filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. She stood before him, wrapped in a long coat, her face pale against the cold. Her once perfect composure was replaced by something raw and unsettled. "Ricardo," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I need to talk to you." "What are you doing here?" Ricardo asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "I thought you left Willow Creek for good." Beatrice's gaze dropped to the ground. "I did. But I couldn't stay away. Not until I said what I need to say." Reluctantly, Ricardo gestured for her to step inside the workshop. The warmth of the wood stove did little to thaw the icy tension between them as they stood facing each other, the hum of machinery in the background. "Say what you came to say, Beatrice," Ricardo said, crossing his arms. "I don't have all day." Beatrice hesitated, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since I left. About you, about us, about everything I've done. And I realized I need to take responsibility for the way I treated you." Ricardo's jaw tightened. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" "I know," Beatrice said quickly, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need you to know how sorry I am. You didn't deserve what I did to you, Ricardo. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Ricardo felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was buried beneath the weight of everything she had put him through. "Why now?" Ricardo asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Why come back and say this now, when I'm finally starting to move on?" Beatrice looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Because I needed to see you one last time. To tell you that I'm trying to change. I've started therapy, I've cut ties with the people who brought out the worst in me, and I'm trying to rebuild my life, Ricardo. I thought you should know." Ricardo studied her for a long moment, his emotions warring within him. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but he couldn't forget the pain she had caused. "I hope you do change, Beatrice," he said finally, his tone measured. "But I can't be a part of that journey. I've already moved on." Beatrice nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I understand. And I'm glad you found peace. You deserve it." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll always regret losing you, Ricardo. But I hope you find happiness, real happiness." When she was gone, Ricardo let out a long breath, his chest tight with the weight of their encounter. He knew it was the closure he needed, but it still left him feeling unsettled. That evening, he called Helena. "Helena," he said when she answered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Beatrice came to see me today." Helena was silent for a moment before responding. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," Ricardo said, running a hand through his hair. "She said she wanted to apologize. That she's trying to change." "And do you believe her?" Helena asked gently. "I think she's being sincere," Ricardo admitted. "But it doesn't change anything. I told her I've moved on. And I meant it." Helena's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Ricardo." Facing her again couldn't have been easy. "It wasn't," he said honestly. "But I think I needed it. To finally let go of everything she put me through." The next day, Ricardo found himself back in his workshop, determined to channel his emotions into his work. He was sanding the edge of a coffee table when his phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a text from an unknown number. "Ricardo, it's Lucas. I need to see you. It's important." Ricardo stared at the message, his stomach twisting. He hadn't heard from Lucas since their meeting at the docks, and he wasn't sure he wanted to now. But something about the message felt urgent, and against his better judgment, he typed a reply. "Where?" Lucas suggested a small diner on the edge of town, a quiet place where they wouldn't be disturbed. Ricardo arrived first, taking a seat in the back corner. When Lucas walked in, he looked haggard, his clothes rumpled and his face shadowed with stubble. He slid into the booth across from Ricardo, his expression heavy with guilt. "Thanks for meeting me," Lucas said, his voice low. "Get to the point," Ricardo replied, his tone cold. Lucas hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we talked. And I realized I need to make things right." Ricardo raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "I want to come clean," Lucas said, his voice steady. "About everything. About what I did to you, about what happened with Beatrice. I want to tell the truth, even if it costs me everything." Ricardo studied him, searching for any sign of deception. "Why now? Why not months ago, before you wrecked my life?" "Because I wasn't ready," Lucas admitted. "But I am now. And I need your help to do it." Ricardo leaned back, his arms crossed. "You want my help? After everything you've done?" "Yes," Lucas said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't fix the past, Ricardo, but I can try to make amends. Please." Ricardo stared at him, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave Lucas to deal with the mess he had created. But another part, the part that still valued the friendship they once had, wanted to hear him out. After a long pause, Ricardo nodded. "All right, Lucas. I'll listen. But this better be worth it." The tension between Ricardo and Lucas was palpable as they sat across from each other in the quiet diner. Ricardo's gaze was sharp, unrelenting, while Lucas seemed to shrink under its weight. "Start talking," Ricardo said, his tone clipped. Lucas swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "It's about Beatrice, and everything that happened. You deserve to know the whole truth." Ricardo leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm listening." Lucas took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly as he began. "You already know that I betrayed you. But what you don't know is how far it went, or why it started in the first place." Ricardo's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting Lucas continue. "It wasn't just about Beatrice," Lucas admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. "It was about everything I felt toward you. The jealousy, the resentment. You were always one step ahead, always the one everyone admired. I hated that I could never measure up." Ricardo's chest tightened. "So, you decided to destroy me? That's your excuse?" "No," Lucas said quickly. "There's no excuse for what I did. But I need you to understand, it wasn't planned. At least, not at first." Ricardo raised an eyebrow, his voice cold. "And when did it become a plan?" Lucas hesitated, then sighed. "It was Beatrice. She saw the cracks in our friendship and she used them. She knew I envied you, and she fed into it, made me feel like I could finally have something you didn't." Ricardo's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. "So, what? You're saying this was all her idea?" "No," Lucas said, shaking his head. "I'm not blaming her entirely. I made my own choices. I let her manipulate me because I wanted to believe I was taking control of something in my life. But in the end, all I did was hurt you, and myself." The diner's hum of activity felt distant as Ricardo processed Lucas's words. Memories of their friendship flashed through his mind, mingling with the pain of betrayal. "I don't care about your reasons," Ricardo said finally, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You destroyed something that mattered to both of us. And for what? A woman who didn't care about either of us?" Lucas flinched at the harshness of Ricardo's words but didn't argue. "You're right," he admitted. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. That's why I need to make things right. I want to tell the truth, to everyone. To clear your name and take responsibility for what I've done." Ricardo frowned, skepticism creeping into his expression. "And what does that mean, exactly? What are you planning to do?" Lucas leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I'm going to write a letter. To the paper, to the town. I'm going to admit what I did, how I hurt you, and how I let Beatrice manipulate me. People deserve to know the truth, and you deserve to have your reputation back." For a moment, Ricardo didn't know what to say. He had spent months grappling with the weight of Lucas's betrayal, and now the man was offering him a chance at vindication. "And what do you expect from me?" Ricardo asked finally. "Nothing," Lucas said quickly. "This isn't about me asking for your forgiveness. I need to do this. For you. For myself. For everything I've ruined." Ricardo studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But for the first time in months, Lucas seemed genuinely remorseful. "Do what you need to do," Ricardo said eventually, his voice cold. "But don't expect anything from me." Lucas nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Thank you, Ricardo. I promise, I'll make this right." As Lucas left the diner, Ricardo remained in his seat, his emotions a tangled mess. He wanted to believe Lucas's intentions were genuine, but the scars of betrayal were too deep to ignore. That evening, Ricardo called Helena, his voice heavy with the weight of the day's events. "Helena, I met with Lucas," he said. Her tone immediately shifted to concern. "How did it go?" "He told me everything," Ricardo said, his voice flat. "About how Beatrice manipulated him. About how he's planning to tell the town the truth." There was a pause on the other end. "Do you believe him?" Helena asked gently. "I don't know," Ricardo admitted. "But part of me hopes he's serious. I'm tired of carrying this around, Helena. I just want it to be over." Helena's voice softened. "You deserve that, Ricardo. Whatever happens, just know you're stronger than all of this." Over the next few days, Ricardo focused on his work, trying to push Lucas and Beatrice from his mind. But the tension lingered, a constant reminder of the storm he had endured. One morning, as Ricardo was finishing a chair in his workshop, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a friend, accompanied by a photo of the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette. Lucas James, a confession. Ricardo's heart raced as he opened the article. In it, Lucas detailed everything: his jealousy, his betrayal, and Beatrice's role in their downfall. He admitted to manipulating their friendship, to letting his insecurities guide his actions, and to hurting Ricardo in ways he could never take back. The article ended with a public apology. "To Ricardo, I know I can never undo the pain I've caused. But I hope that by telling the truth, I can give you the peace and closure you deserve. You were always the better man." Ricardo stared at the screen, his emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and something resembling relief. Lucas's confession wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing. Later that evening, Ricardo sat on his porch, the crisp winter air biting at his skin. When Helena arrived, she wrapped herself in a thick coat and joined him, her presence a steady comfort. "Did you see the article?" Helena asked softly. "I did," Ricardo replied, his voice even. "And how do you feel?" Ricardo let out a long breath, watching it curl into the cold air. "Lighter, I think. It doesn't change what he did, but it helps." Helena placed a hand on his, her touch grounding him. "That's all you can ask for, Ricardo. Healing takes time, but you're on the right path." As they sat together, the weight of the past felt just a little lighter. And for the first time in months, Ricardo allowed himself to hope for a brighter future. The days following Lucas's confession sent ripples through Willow Creek. The article in the Willow Creek Gazette became the talk of the town, with everyone weighing in on the scandal. Some sympathized with Ricardo, praising him for how he had handled the betrayal, while others debated whether Lucas's public apology was genuine or a desperate bid for redemption. Ricardo did his best to stay out of the fray, focusing on his work and avoiding the curious stares and whispers that followed him whenever he went into town. But no matter how much he tried to keep his head down, the attention was impossible to ignore. One morning, as Ricardo was picking up supplies at the hardware store, he overheard a conversation between two older women near the counter. "I just don't understand why Lucas felt the need to air all that dirty laundry," one woman said, her tone disapproving. "It's not like it fixes anything." "Well, I think it's brave," the other woman replied. "He admitted his mistakes, didn't he? That takes courage." "But what about Ricardo?" the first woman countered. "He's the real victim here. And now everyone's going to keep dragging his name through the mud." Ricardo clenched his jaw and quickly paid for his items, avoiding eye contact with the women as he left. The last thing he wanted was to be the center of a town debate. Later that day, Ricardo returned to his workshop, determined to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of sanding and shaping wood. But as he worked, his phone buzzed with a call. When he saw Helena's name on the screen, he sighed in relief, grateful for a distraction. "Hey," he answered, setting down his tools. "Hey," Helena replied, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Ricardo admitted. "The town won't stop talking about the article. It feels like I can't escape it." Helena sighed. "I'm sorry, Ricardo. People love to gossip, especially in a place like Willow Creek. But you've handled this with more grace than most people ever could." Her words brought a small smile to his lips. "Thanks, Helena. That means a lot." That evening, Helena invited Ricardo to her home for dinner. When he arrived, he was greeted by the comforting scent of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. "I thought you could use a good meal," Helena said, ushering him inside. They sat at her kitchen table, the soft glow of candlelight casting a warm ambience over the room. As they ate, Helena steered the conversation away from the town's gossip, asking Ricardo about his latest projects and sharing stories about her garden and her plans to redecorate the house. "You're always so busy," Ricardo said with a chuckle. "I don't know how you find the time for everything." Helena smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I've learned to make time for the things that matter." Her words carried a weight that wasn't lost on Ricardo. He set down his fork, his gaze meeting hers. "Helena," he began, his voice steady. "You've been such an important part of my life these past few months. I don't think I could have gotten through everything without you." Helena reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "And I don't think I could have found my way back to myself without you, Ricardo." After dinner, they moved to the living room, sipping tea by the fire. The conversation turned reflective as they shared stories from their pasts, their words weaving a tapestry of vulnerability and trust. "Do you ever wonder what life would be like if things had gone differently?" Ricardo asked, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Helena tilted her head, considering the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but that doesn't mean it can't still be beautiful." Her words resonated deeply with Ricardo. He had spent so much time mourning the life he thought he would have with Beatrice that he had almost forgotten to appreciate the life he was building now. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere between them grew more intimate, the unspoken feelings that had been simmering for weeks finally coming to the surface. "Helena," Ricardo said softly, turning to face her. "I don't know where this is going, but I care about you. More than I ever expected." Helena's eyes glistened with emotion as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "I care about you too, Ricardo. And I don't want to let fear or the past hold us back anymore." For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with anticipation. Then, slowly, Ricardo leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, lingering kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Helena smiled, her cheeks flushed. "Well," she said with a soft laugh, "I guess that settles that." Ricardo chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in months. "Yeah, I guess it does." As they sat together, their hands intertwined, Ricardo felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The wounds of his past were still there, but for the first time, they didn't define him. With Helena by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning after Ricardo and Helena's kiss, the world felt brighter, softer, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his chest. He woke with a quiet sense of joy, a feeling he hadn't known in months. For once, his thoughts didn't immediately return to the betrayals of the past but to the promise of what lay ahead. Helena. He thought of her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the quiet strength she carried. Their relationship, if he could call it that now, was still new and unspoken in many ways, but Ricardo felt a steady assurance that they were moving towards something real. The day passed quickly as Ricardo worked in his shop, completing the last of his orders for the week. The rhythmic hum of his tools and the scent of freshly cut wood grounded him, but his thoughts were never far from Helena. By evening, he found himself standing outside her house again, a bouquet of daisies in his hand. He had agonized over the gesture, wondering if it was too much or too soon. But as the door opened and Helena greeted him with a warm smile, his worries melted away. "Ricardo," she said, her tone full of pleasant surprise. "What's this?" "Just a thank you," Ricardo replied, holding out the flowers. "For everything." Helena took the bouquet, her cheeks flushing. "They're beautiful." "Thank you." She stepped aside to let him in, and they settled into the living room with cups of tea. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. "Have you been into town today?" Helena asked as they sat side by side on the couch. Ricardo shook his head. "No." "Why?" Helena sighed, setting her cup down. "The town is still buzzing about Lucas's confession. It's like everyone has an opinion, and they're not afraid to share it." Ricardo frowned. "What are they saying now?" "Most people seem to sympathize with you," Helena said. "But there are a few who think Lucas is trying to make himself look like a hero by coming clean. And some, well, they're questioning what's happening between us." Ricardo's chest tightened. He had known their relationship would draw attention, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real. "What about you?" he asked. "How do you feel about it?" Helena reached for his hand, her touch steady and reassuring. "I knew there would be whispers, Ricardo. But I don't care what people think. All that matters is how we feel about each other." Her words filled Ricardo with a quiet determination. "I feel the same," he said, his voice firm. "Let them talk. We've been through worse than gossip." The following weekend, Helena and Ricardo decided to face the town together. They went to the local farmers' market, a bustling hub of activity where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As they walked through the rows of stalls, Helena's hand lightly brushing against his, Ricardo could feel the curious stares of the townspeople. Some smiled warmly, while others whispered behind their hands. "Stay calm," Helena murmured, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. "I'm calm," Ricardo replied, though his jaw was tight. Near the center of the market, they ran into Dolores, who was chatting with a group of her friends. When she saw Ricardo and Helena, her eyebrows shot up, but she quickly masked her surprise with a polite smile. "Ricardo," she said, stepping forward. "And Helena. Good to see you both." "Hi, Ma," Ricardo said, his tone cautious. Dolores glanced between them, her expression unreadable. "I was just telling the ladies here how proud I am of you, Ricardo. Your woodworking business is the talk of the town." "Thank you," Ricardo said, his voice softening. "And Helena, Dolores continued, her smile warming. It's good to see you too. I hope you've been keeping my son in line. Helena laughed, her response easy and natural. I'm doing my best. The interaction ended quickly, with Dolores excusing herself to rejoin her friends. But as Ricardo and Helena continued through the market, Ricardo couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. His mother's acceptance, subtle as it was, meant more than he wanted to admit. That evening, Ricardo and Helena returned to her house, their spirits light after facing the town together. As they sat on the porch, the sky painted with the soft hues of sunset, Ricardo turned to her, his expression serious. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady. Helena raised an eyebrow, her gaze curious. About what? About us, Ricardo said. About where this is going. Helena's expression softened. And what have you decided? Ricardo hesitated, searching for the right words. I know it's not going to be easy, Helena. There's a lot we'll have to face, together. But I'm not afraid of that. I care about you, and I'm ready to see where this leads. Helena reached for his hand, her eyes shining with emotion. I care about you too, Ricardo. And I'm ready, too. As they sat together, the world around them fading into the quiet of the evening, Ricardo felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to embrace it. With Helena by his side, anything seemed possible. The early spring sun cast a golden glow over Willow Creek as Ricardo stepped back to admire his latest project, a handcrafted bench made from reclaimed wood. The piece was special, not just because of the craftsmanship, but because it would be placed in the town square, a symbol of renewal and community. The commission had come after Lucas's confession, when the town had finally started to rally around Ricardo. The attention was unexpected, but it gave him an opportunity to connect with his neighbors in a way he hadn't before. As Ricardo wiped his hands on a rag, the sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Helena stood in the doorway of his workshop, her smile soft and familiar. It's beautiful, she said, gesturing to the bench. The town's going to love it. Ricardo smiled, setting the rag aside. I hope so. It feels good to give something back. Helena stepped closer, her hand lightly brushing against his arm. You've already given so much, Ricardo. More than you realize. That afternoon, the town square was bustling with activity as locals gathered for the bench's unveiling. Ricardo stood near the edge of the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and nerves. Helena was by his side, her presence a steadying force. When the mayor called Ricardo forward to say a few words, he hesitated for a moment before stepping up. The faces in the crowd blurred slightly, but Helena's warm gaze anchored him. I'm not much for speeches, Ricardo began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. But I just want to say thank you, to all of you. The past few months have been a journey, and I wouldn't be here without the support of this community. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. This bench isn't just a piece of furniture. It's a reminder that even when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt, stronger, better. And I'm grateful to all of you for helping me rebuild. The crowd erupted in applause, and as Ricardo stepped back, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known in years. After the event, Ricardo and Helena strolled through the square, enjoying the vibrant energy of the town. You handled that beautifully, Helena said, her smile filled with pride. I had a good reason to stay calm, Ricardo replied, his eyes meeting hers. You. Helena blushed, her laughter soft and genuine. I think you're giving me too much credit. I don't think I'm giving you enough, Ricardo countered, his tone sincere. They stopped near the fountain in the center of the square, the sound of the water creating a peaceful backdrop. Ricardo turned to Helena, his expression serious. Helena, he began, taking her hand in his. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you to be part of it. You've been my anchor, my guide, and my friend. And I want to build a life with you, together." Helena's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Ricardo, I've spent so much of my life feeling like I was just surviving. But with you, I feel alive again. I want that future too." The weeks that followed were filled with new beginnings. Ricardo's woodworking business continued to flourish, with orders pouring in from across the region. Helena, inspired by Ricardo's resilience, decided to take on a project of her own, starting a community garden to bring the town closer together. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing day, the foundation they had built rooted in trust, understanding, and shared dreams. One sunny afternoon, as they worked side by side in Helena's garden, Ricardo paused to take in the scene. The vibrant flowers, the laughter of children playing nearby, and the warmth of Helena's presence, it was everything he had hoped for and more. For the first time in a long time, Ricardo felt at peace. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they were a testament to his strength and the love he had found with Helena. As he reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining, Ricardo knew one thing with certainty: the best chapters of his life were still ahead.